thank you for taking the time to join us for what I think is going to be a really fascinating and really important talk. I'm going to get us started here by just framing the discussion, and we'll ask a few questions of Pam, but then really want to open it up for questions from you all. We're using hashtag #TeachForAll to surface questions, and you can also email Jen Brenneman, Jennifer.Brenneman, 2 N's, at teachforall.org if you have other questions. So at Teach for All, we know that so many children with whom we're working and around the world are experiencing just profound adversity as they move through our schools. I'm sorry, I'm hesitating because I have something in my throat, but I'm going to get through this. So perhaps they've been exposed to violence and loss. They're living in poverty and don't know where their next meal is coming from. And as we've learned more about the science behind how children's brains grow and develop, we know that that type of chronic stress actually impairs kids' brain development. So adversity actually changes kids' brains and makes it more difficult for them to learn, to develop the kind of performance skills and relationship skills and social skills necessary to succeed in life. The hopeful news is that we can actually do something about it. And I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Pamela Cantor, who is really maybe the best person in our view, to tell us exactly how to do that. She was a practicing child psychologist, specializing in childhood trauma, and is now working to put into practice everything that we know about children's brains development and adversity and achievement. So thank you so much, Dr. Cantor, for joining us today to share your learnings with our network.
Thank you so much, Wendy.
So I thought we'd just get started by asking you to share a bit about what brought you to this, what led you to start Turnaround for Children.
My background before founding Turnaround was as a child psychiatrist, and I was focused on trauma and the way that trauma affects children's growth and development. And so in practicing for many years, one of the striking things that I noticed is that independent of what happened to the child, they often showed up in my office with the very same things. They had issues with trust, issues with relationships, and all of them had learning and behavioral issues in school. So it wasn't event specific. It wasn't even always intensity specific, but the pattern was there. So when 9/11 happened, I was asked to consult to the New York City DOE about the effect of the 9/11 trauma on New York City's public school kids. And that's the event that brought me into high poverty public schools. And it was an astonishing thing to see how we educate children who are growing up in poverty in this country. So when I looked at the schools in the South Bronx, in Central Brooklyn, in Washington Heights, what was very striking to me was that education was not looking at what was going on with kids through the lens of development. It was looking at performance, it was looking at accountability, it was looking at instruction. But what I was seeing were lots and lots of kids who were just in school not ready for learning. And the founding of Turnaround came about because I knew there was a connection between the adversity the kids were experiencing and the challenges and pattern of challenges we were seeing in the schools. And Turnaround was founded to unpack that and address it.
Interesting. So can you explain more about the science behind how adversity affects children's brain development?
Sure. One of the things that I think is obvious and not so obvious at the same time, and that is that adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. So just taking in this idea that something that happens to you can set off your hypothalamic pituitary axis it can kick off the release of a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol releases a bunch of other chemicals that are actually very toxic to children's development, both the development of their learning brains and the development of their immune systems. So it's not surprising that the children we see in our schools not only have learning and behavioral problems, they often have concurrent health problems as well. And there's actually one neurobiologic mechanism that explains this. So when you think about the learning issues specifically, we zero in on something called the limbic system, which consists of three structures. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for attention and concentration. It's our organizer. The hippocampus, which is centrally involved with a lot of working memory functions and other learning functions. And the amygdala, a very critical structure that is the brain's emotional smoke detector. It's the structure in the brain that remembers what happens to us in life. And when these structures develop, and this is so critically important, they develop largely after we're born. And they are cross-wired. So what this means is that the environments and relationships that children are subjected to in their childhood actually shape the development of the brain. So if those environments and relationships are rich and trustful and safe, then really good things happen in terms of development. But if those environments are filled with stress and children are not feeling protected and safe in their environments, something else happens. And we now know this from brain imaging. There is evidence that chronic recurrent stress that is not buffered can actually change the architecture of the brain.
So, I'm dying to get into the implications of all that for what we can do and what teachers in particular can do. And I wonder, we're always trying to understand what are the differentiators of the most successful teachers. And I'm wondering, in your experience, what you've found to be the biggest differentiators.
Well, I'm going to talk about this from a perspective of just what you're saying and what's implied by what you're saying, because here is where the opportunity lies. If a brain is malleable into adulthood, think about the opportunity in that. One of the things I was asked for the Nova show last night, School of the Future, which if you have not seen it, it will be available on PBS, is science an optimistic story or a pessimistic story? It's an optimistic story. Because if brains are malleable, it means that we have two very powerful levers, environments and relationships, that we can do something about that can actually influence the development of a child's brain, either from the perspective of healing or the perspective of growth. So I want to share one neurobiologic story to show you the level at which this is true. Lots of you have probably heard the story of cortisol and stress. But how many of you have actually heard the story of oxytocin? Oxytocin is the love hormone. Oxytocin is a hormone that actually gets released when children feel safe and protected, when they feel that they are in the presence of a buffering relationship. So humans can be that buffer. A whole other cascade of hormones gets released that mitigate the effects of stress on the developing brain. So when I think of the question that you're asking, what can a teacher be? What can a parent be? What can a youth development person be? They can be people with enormous amounts of power to affect the development of children.
It's really interesting because I think, as many of you know, one of the biggest findings from our own research, which Stephen has been, who you know, has been working on with others over time, is that relationships is one of the biggest differentiators among the most transformational teachers. So it's just so fascinating to understand the science behind why that ultimately is the case. I was really interested to read your building blocks for learning paper and wonder if you can share more about that, how it came about, what you learned through that research.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we were curious about, I think that if I were to go around the room and you haven't read Building Blocks, then I would say, for the children you know in your life that have been very successful, what are the traits they have in common? And you know, if this were a smaller seminar, we'd go around the room and talk about that. But they would probably be the skills that you see at the top of the Building Blocks. But if I were to say to you as teachers working with struggling kids, where do your kids struggle? It would probably be some of the things that you see in the bottom of those Building Blocks. So we were very curious to answer the question, is there a pathway by which children begin to develop their skills to be ready and engaged learners? And if so, where does it start? And if we knew something about where it started, would there be a pathway that's discernible by which kids could get to the skills that you see at the top? So a group of us, led by Brooke Brizard, who was the lead author of the paper, read every bit of literature that we could get our hands on from diverse fields, not actually intending to build a framework. We just wanted to see where the research was strongest. This framework actually fell out of the literature. And it fell out of the literature. Thanks. Oh, does that mean something bad happened?
It's okay, I think.
Okay. What fell out of the literature was a set of skills where there was actually a discernible order to the ways in which they unfolded. So the first set of things that we realized is that the skills that you see on the bottom two rows of building blocks are actually the skills associated with a healthy developing limbic system. So attachment, executive function, self-regulation, all of those skills are the skills that a child developing healthily would expect to have between the ages of 0 and 5. So think about this in terms of kids and their readiness for kindergarten. So one of the big ahas here is that our K-12 system is organized as if children have these skills in place when they enter kindergarten, and they don't, or they don't in any kind of even, uniform kind of way. Second, we were really interested in this idea of if children didn't have these skills, would they be at higher risk not to develop the skills that you see at the top? And there we found some very, very strong correlations between the lower order skills and connections to things we all care a lot about, like academic tenacity, like resilience. So it was very important to us to, in looking at this framework, to say that we actually believe there is, in principle, a way for any classroom to intentionally develop these skills. But one would have to pay attention to maybe the three biggest criteria in this framework. And that is, it's scientifically based. It understands that skills don't develop in isolation. They develop with other skills, and they develop in a sequence. So if the folks working on this kind of thing are going to be developing frameworks, the frameworks have to respect those three factors.
And so can you say more about the pathway, like how we do move kids from the bottom to the top?
We found a couple of really interesting correlations. Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset and also on academic tenacity found very strong correlations between self-regulation, executive function, and these higher order skills. We also found strong correlations in Matson's work between self-regulation and resilience. So two of the skills that are most relevant to overcoming the effects of adversity on learning were actually strongly correlated with how well we develop those lower order skills.
Interesting. So back to the teacher question, I guess the question would be, like, what do educators have to do right then? Like, if you could just boil it down, to actually best support the kids who are struggling in these conditions of adversity.
Well, that's the central question that our organization, Turnaround for Children, is working on, because we know that we're never going to get the opportunity to do an infinite number of things. So if you think about the fundamental concepts that we've talked about so far, one of them is stress. And one of the things about stress that we've talked about is the human buffer. So environments that buffer stress, environments that are relationship rich, is absolutely a baseline. If you try to develop these skills and children do not feel physically and emotionally safe, they either can't develop or they reverse. And there's a lot of literature coming out of early childhood that when children in early childhood have developed executive function self-regulation skills and they go into a scary kindergarten, the skills basically just melt away. So the issue of physical emotional safety, relationship rich, buffering stress, that's the baseline. And then the intentional promotion of skills. So I often get asked this, and I'm going to say this, but this is not proven. So just want to put this out there. These are hypotheses we're testing. Based on everything that I've read, if you combined self-regulation, executive function, growth mindset, if you combine those three, you would get the baseline of skills that kids need to become ready and engaged learners. But these are precisely the hypotheses that Turnaround is testing in its own work.
Interesting. I want to open this up. Do any of you all have questions? And I know I'm going to start getting them online, but I have yet to see them come through. Any questions?
Hi.
I'm going to have to repeat these questions, I'm afraid, given the system. And the question was, given how early these issues start, how are you focusing on preschool, and what can we do at that level?
I think that I can tell you who is focused on that. All of our schools have pre-Ks, and so pre-K teachers are engaged in the work of our program. But at the, at the macro level, we've actually seen a trend in preschool away from doing the work that is most critical for preschools to do. So here's what's happened. The movement in preschools is now to prove that a preschool is good, you need to be ready for school. So just like what's happening in older aged classrooms, it's academics, academics, and academics. The notion that preschool legitimately is a place for learning how to build relationships, learning how to self-regulate, learning how to focus and attend. Preschool has actually been hurt by the demand for kids to be ready for instructional work. And so folks that were like Jack Shunkoff, who you could argue is the father of early childhood education, is now having to defend the place of a focus on human development in a preschool context.
I saw a number of other questions, so I'm actually going to get you all to ask your questions into the mic.
Hi, I'm Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Hi. How late is too late to do this work? I'm 40. I assume my prefrontal cortex is pretty cooked by this point. Can you do it with a 10th grader? Is there work, or is it too late by that point?
When I went to med school, I was told that you're pretty much done by the time you're 5. And so this is a while back, but not so far back. And it is fascinating how much that has changed, because right now what's in the literature is early adulthood, so 25, 26, 27. But even more important than the fact of that time horizon is that it used to be said that 0 to 5 was the critical period or the critical period. Now there is a whole wave of research on the adolescent and early adulthood brain, and some things that are very unique that offer opportunities in the development of older kids. So older kids have a propensity not always to tie effect to cause, to recognize risk. I mean, many of these things are things that can be influenced. But everything that you see on the building blocks framework should be thought of as things that can be developed over that time horizon. To change you, no, but actually someone asked a question about the top of the building block. It was a workforce audience, and they wanted to know, whether adults or young adults could develop those skills. And it does require much more will on the part of the person to be able to do that, but it is still possible.
This is very encouraging, because seriously. Here's a question from online. Are the building blocks at the bottom of the pyramid prerequisites for those at the top? I know you touched on this a bit, but to be concrete, if I am teaching 17-year-olds, this is written by a former teacher, do I need to work on self-regulation before I can work on resilience, or can I teach both at the same time? This feels critical late in high school when we have limited time before kids graduate.
I think that the pathways for skill development run into each other. Okay, I don't know what happened there. One of the things that is going on now in instruction is a great emphasis on differentiation based on where a child is. So the deepest answer to the question that's being asked is that if you are teaching resilience and a child isn't able to do it, the likeliest reasons can be found in inadequate development of earlier skills. And the ability to differentiate that and not just teach a higher order skill, independent of whether a child can absorb it, is really more the question that I would ask. I also think that these are not absolute categories. A 17-year-old, in all likelihood, will have some self-regulation skills, but if they are really the barrier to an ability to persevere, then yes, you have to get the fundamental skills developed or combine them.
I'm going to ask another one from online, but feel free to keep coming in with you all's questions as well. What are some of the specific practices that teachers can utilize to support kids who are suffering from chronic stress?
So I think that one prerequisite is to absolutely be sure that any child has, well, one thing I think that is important to say at the outset is if you know that that child has a cause of chronic stress, the cause has to be looked into, because a child who is subjected to chronic stress is not going to be as readily able to take the intervention that you're offering. But the single most powerful intervention is you. It's your ability to be the caring, trusted adult that believes in them, that will keep them safe, and that enables them to recover from a disappointment that would inevitably happen. So if you look at that as the gold, then there are two strategies that I would talk about. One is something that we call 2 by 10. And so let's say a teacher has a child in a classroom that is just acting out. And that teacher has even decided that it is a cry for attention. So one of the things we do is on 10 consecutive days, a teacher spends 2 minutes with that child, just talking about stuff, not talking about work, not talking about assignments, not talking about anything that they have to do. 2 minutes, 10 consecutive days. It's a doable thing, but it begins to focus the child on that relationship is there for them. Another one is the virtuous cycle of disappointment, which may sound a little bit like a paradox, but any disappointment that a child is having in your classroom is your biggest opportunity to be that person. So if you use the child whose head is on the desk, who's struggling with a math problem, to be the person that offers to be a help, gives a tool that's in more the proximal zone of something the child can do, creates the win, and then you get the virtuous cycle of belief and energy, and yes, I'll try more. That is one of the powerful combinations of trust building and growth mindset.
Can you actually tell us about a school in New York where you've actually seen these strategies at work and kind of speak to how that's influenced what goes on at that school?
Sure. I think that the example I'm going to give you is actually one of our DC schools. I'm picking that school for a particular reason. One is that it's a new school, so we've only been with this school for 1 year, so it's very easy and fresh to talk about its challenges. And I think we've gotten better at how we sequence our own intervention. So this is a school that had, relatively speaking, a strong instructional leader, but a leader who didn't trust his teachers and didn't believe his teachers trusted him. In fact, when we began working with this school, he didn't want to meet in the building because he didn't want his teachers to see him talking to us. So there was a tremendous amount of professional distrust within the staff, and the kids felt it. The kids felt the building as not a safe place to be. Turnaround's environmental work is focused on physical safety, emotional safety, the teacher-student connection, relational trust. So the interventions that we brought into the building were very focused on the connections that this leader had with his teachers, and as well as the typical kinds of things that we do in our classrooms. What we saw happen within a year's time is a teaching body that was able to see this leader as somebody they could connect with and relate to. Right now, his approval ratings, the indicators that we use in terms of teacher surveys of relational trust with him went from something like 3% to 69% in 1 year. So when you go to that school today, you would walk in and see a much, much tighter and trustful community.
Wow, how did that happen?
Well, would you like me to tell you a little bit just about how we work?
I think it would be I think it would be good, yeah, to get as specific as we can. I mean, without revealing anything you shouldn't.
Okay, so Turnaround has a team that consists of a program director, an instructional coach, and a social work consultant. And that composition of team works with a small cluster of schools. We select our schools based on challenges, particularly around environment, issues of relational trust, children's development. All of our schools are very, very low performing academically. But the barriers to performance very much fall into this environmental developmental basket. So this team begins to work on a plan with the principal, usually the spring before we enter a building. The program director works closely with the principal, and our instructional coaches deliver about 26 modules of professional development in small group instruction every week to the teachers. And the leaders have to sign on to the delivery of that professional development. We're obviously focused very heavily on caring communities, talking circles, teaching strategies that build a sense of a trustful community in the classroom and enable teachers to form close bonds with kids. But a barrier of doing an hour of professional development every week for every teacher is a significant barrier in regular district public schools. And most of our schools, there has been a tremendous destruction of the professional learning community. So in a very interesting way, having this kind of regular instruction with teachers that happens every week, an instructional coach that goes into the classroom that provides individual coaching for teachers, begins to restore for teachers a sense that they are not alone and that somebody is really supporting their development. Continual learning, continual feedback. The social worker is paired with a mental health provider. We are the people who pick the mental health provider, and we scope the contract of the mental health provider so that we resolve a lot of barriers that traditionally exist between high poverty schools and community-based providers. So if you think about the program as a whole, it's a big focus on leadership, education about adversity, and a focus on environment and development, teacher training, and then a student support system that makes much better use of the resources in the community.
Questions here? Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think that doing family outreach and family engagement well is one of the toughest things in the whole effort to improve schools. But here's what I specifically mean by that. Our deepest connection to family comes through our student support systems, where there is outreach and education of families. There's a student support team structure that we establish in a school, and when children are discussed, the families are a part of that discussion. I think our closest connection to families is coming by that route. The second level is the training that we do with teachers. But I think that even for the work that my own single organization does, we have found very valuable partnering with organizations who particularly zero in on families. And in DC, our favorite is an organization called Flamboyant that does a really, really beautiful job of creating the kind of bandwidth that our own organization can't fully provide. So we partner to achieve it, but we absolutely recognize that that's a really important dimension of the work.
Similarly, I'm curious about what the research or your hypotheses show about the intergenerational effects of stress. I think about it specifically around the refugee crisis and what the capacity for learning and these skill building will happen in communities where we've lost a huge capacity for skill in the parents. So looking forward in your research.
Yeah. I think that here too, there's a positive side to the story, but also I think a somewhat scary side to the story. Earlier in our discussion, I talked about the effects of chronic stress on learning and the effects of chronic stress on health. But I didn't talk about the effects of chronic stress on the expression of our genes. And one of the things that we are understanding more and more today is that there is a direct impact of chronic stress on the expression of the genome. So if I were to say to you, how many genes does the human genome have? It's 25,000, and less than 100 of those genes get expressed in a person's lifetime. So we have to ask ourselves what determines which genes get expressed or not. And what we increasingly understand is that it is the environment that children are raised in that has a most profound effect on gene expression. And when I said there was a scary part, the scary part is that when genes are affected in their structure, that structure is what's passed to a next generation. So when you look at illnesses like diabetes, or you look at obesity, or you look at the intergenerational roots of violence, this is what accounts for that picture. So when I look at the refugee crisis, what I am looking at is the intergenerational transmission of PTSD and symptoms that relate to fear.
This seems like, I mean, shifting gears just a bit, this, to me, it feels like we're kind of entering a new kind of era of lots of possibility in this kind of broader and global effort to expand educational opportunity and really ensure through our schools and related supports that all of our kids fulfill their true potential. Like, it feels like the conversation is in a different place today, quite a very different place, to me at least in the little circles in which we're running around, than it was, say, even just 2 or 3 years ago. And I guess I wonder how you see that, like how you see the kind of opportunities right now and also the challenges as we think about, you know, working together across our various organizations and really trying to get to a very different place for kids.
Sure. So going in the time capsule with you, I mean, if we look at our 20th century school design and what that system was designed for, it was designed based on ideas about averages, based on ideas about mass producing an education model. And it was okay with fewer than 30% of kids going to college. So then that system arrived in the 21st century, not at all designed for what we want children to be able to do. So we have one problem, which is just this structure that was created for a different purpose. And what do we do with that structure? So then the wave of reform that Wendy and I have been a part of began to look for a different way of teaching and, to some significant degree, a different design for schools. But it was done, I think, to a degree still, based on averages, based on ideas of we will move kids academically to a particular goal. What I'm hearing today and what I see as the most optimistic part of this story, I see an opportunity for the education part of education to become more and more individualized, more and more differentiated, and for our teaching world to be development-oriented and relationship-oriented. But that is a very big reorientation of our system. But were we to do that, the science tells a very optimistic story of where all of that will end up. That's what I'm most excited about.
It is so exciting. I mean, you all know that our big global conference this year is on this theme of reimagining education. And I just think it's so exciting to be at this place where we really are talking about, I mean, exactly the issue that you just so beautifully discussed. But it seems like we have just a massive, as you say, challenge on our hands, given that we're all working in systems that are oriented in a very different way towards the average and towards a very narrow set of academic outcomes. So how do we cultivate a generation of leaders who are thinking differently and are working differently within that system, and then pioneering the changes necessary to ultimately shift the whole system? A huge challenge, but it seems really exciting to be at the place where we're having that discussion.
Can I ask you a question? When you think of the systems that produce how and what teachers learn, so the higher ed system, the in-service system, and the systems that you touch, where are you most optimistic about a different trajectory of learning for teachers, and where are you most concerned?
I don't know that I'm not going to be able to answer that question specifically. I mean, I am still very concerned about most of what we see. I mean, I think we just know so little about how teachers develop. I mean, I think we honestly are having kind of an irresponsible conversation in this country and elsewhere around teacher development, because the frame is always, look, we know what to do, we just need to do it. And I don't think that's true. We don't know what to do. And we across Teach for All have really come to realize that. I mean, we have all poured so much ourselves alongside and with many partners in the higher education realm and such, just trying harder and harder and harder and throwing more and more and more at the puzzle of how to develop teachers who will have a truly, like, the kind of impact that we all want to have on kids. And we're realizing that throwing the kitchen sink at this is not helping the problem. And so we really are taking a step back from all of this to say, we're going to have to become much more disciplined about identifying the best hypotheses we can and testing those bets and learning from that, so that we can ultimately develop a much stronger system for teacher development. And we're hoping that we can be one part of that conversation. We have such an opportunity across Teach for All with so many different teams in different contexts, working with different partners, so we can be learning much more quickly than if we were just working, say, in one community or even in one country. I've read a number of things recently, you've mentioned some of them, and that have really helped advance my own understanding of some of these things. And one of them is a book called Helping Children Succeed by Paul Tough, which features Dr. Cantor's work, among others, and is just such a beautiful, beautiful piece. Another is The End of Average by Todd Rose. I mean, I would so highly recommend that everyone in our community reads those books. It sounds like the special from last night is another one that it's a 2-hour special on kind of rethinking school, which speaks to many of the themes that Dr. Cantor has mentioned. And I'm just wondering if there are any other resources that you would point our community to as we think about kind of expanding our own kind of collective understanding of all these issues.
At Turnaround, we do have a favorites file around articles that I'd love to share with your community. In the land of books, I think that one of the ones that was and continues to be a huge influence on me is Switch, Dan Heath's book. Because a lot of what we're thinking about is change and what change requires in whatever system that we're working in. So I think he would be somebody that I'd look at. I think most of our stuff is at the level of articles that I would share.
That's helpful. Well, we're going to get some of those articles and get them out to our folks. And Switch is a great recommendation. have more questions here coming in. Stephen Farr has a question. The Teach for All network is made up of dozens of programs trying to innovate in the ways we develop teachers, and many alumni of these programs are innovating in the teacher education space. In light of the building blocks research, what advice do you have to those of us who are trying to design teacher development programs?
You know, one of the things that I just flashed on is another book that was a huge influence. So I just want to say it so that I don't forget it. It's The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. I don't know whether you know this book by Bruce Perry, but it's the most lucid description of the neurobiology of adversity and its effect on development. It's like a mini course. But it's a terrific book. It's not to be read before bed, but it's a great book. So going to Stephen's question, what I think needs to happen is being mirrored in what is happening in our organization. I mean, we are, if I understand the question, we are currently doing a landscape analysis around where are there tools that can be implemented right now? How should they be sequenced? Meaning, just as I was saying before, skills don't develop in isolation. So the way in which we introduce skill promotion in environments should take into account the science. So a concrete example at Turnaround would be that we're introducing mindfulness and growth mindset together. And that's our first entry into skills development in the classroom. So mindfulness would be for children to reduce stress and be present when the day gets started. And growth mindset teaches children that they actually can grow their brains. So all of our kids are getting an introduction to this idea of the brain's malleability and the idea of tying effort to that you can grow your brain. So I think there's some really interesting things that are available right now, and there is enough science behind it to test a hypothesis.
Here's another question from one of our teams that's watching online. They're basically asking if you're ever able to work in partnership with others to eliminate the underlying stressors, meaning like, do you have broader views on what it would take to actually help reduce the number of children who are suffering from chronic stress?
Well, this is a tough question because there should be, but it's often not on the same timeline. I remember having a conversation with the folks at the Ford Foundation where a question that they posed was, do you want to create a better runner or do you want to fix the track? And it's a false choice. You know, we all know that. So I think that there is a timeline in which we can fix the runner so that we don't lose generations of kids. Many kids develop the resilience to surmount adversity, sometimes with help, even sometimes without help, but very consistently with help. So how can we say no to that? But I think that the issue of fixing the track happens on a longer timeline. And yes, we do have to reduce the amount of adversity that our children are exposed to. There's no question.
Yeah. Any last audience questions? We're nearing time at any rate. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This is just so important, such important research, and it's so beautiful that you're kind of really going into the space of how to support teachers and teacher educators to actually, change the results that we're seeing for kids. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you all. Thanks.